I stand here today as a Canadian, an Iranian, a Muslim, and a feminist. A few years ago, I would have considered these aspects of my identity as completely separate, but today I see them in harmony. I moved to Canada from Iran when I was 9 years old, and living in Canada in the 1970s was very much like living here, I would imagine. I remember having fond memories of play, fun, and adventure, all the things that a young child would hope for. I was born into a Muslim home where I was taught to believe in God. I was taught to give back to the community, and I was taught the importance of education. My parents would say that education is the key to my freedom and independence. I also had very strong female role models in my life, like my grandmother, who studied midwifery, worked in a hospital, and married my grandfather. There were women in my family who chose to wear the veil when they went out, and at that time in Iran, the veil wasn't mandatory. I didn't wear it, and no one forced me to either way. And I remember when I would go out in public with my family, I would see women like my mother who weren't covered, but I would also see women like other women in my family who were, and that was completely normal. They all coexisted. I went to school, I played with boys and girls, and I have fond memories of our summer vacations when my dad would pile us all in to our Volkswagen Bug, and we would trek through the Alborz Mountains to our cottage by the Caspian Sea. I have great memories of playing at the beach for hours on end, swimming in the public pool, and running around in the gardens around our home. And to this day, the smell of jasmine flowers takes me right back to my childhood in Iran and the summers that I had. Eventually, all of that changed. People began to speak out against the Shah of Iran, and there were demonstrations. I remember a movie theater in the city of Abadan was set on fire, and almost 500 people died. That was around the same time when the first Star Wars movie was coming out, and I, like kids all over the world, was so excited to see it. And I remember sitting in the theater, staring in the dark at the walls and wondering, will I see flames? Are we going to die? The demonstrations got worse, and they came closer to home. There was one particular night when the civil unrest was so intense that we heard very loud gunfire, and there were bullets flying over our home. I was so scared, and I prompted my family to hide with me. Martial law was declared, and there were curfews, but that didn't change anything. In fact, the demonstrations got worse. The chaos got worse. Until early 1979, when the Shah of Iran was exiled. I remember the day he left. I was walking with my sister from our home to my grandmother's house, and we came across large crowds cheering with joy. And as I got closer to my grandmother's house, I remember seeing her weeping. And looking at her, I knew that at that point, my life was about to change forever. So my family had some really difficult decisions to make. Were we going to stay in Iran under a new regime, or were we going to leave? My older brother and sister had already been sent to the United States, and months later, I left with my mother, my little brother, and suitcases. We left everything behind that mattered to me. My dad couldn't leave, and he had to make the ultimate sacrifice, and that was to let his kids move away. And I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for him, because we were the center of his universe. I'll never forget my last goodbye. When I clung to him, I hugged him so tight, and I was thinking, will I ever see him again? I did see him again in another 8 years. But at that point, through a 9-year-old's eyes, it felt like I had lost my entire family overnight. Then we moved to Canada, And just like all kids at that age, I wanted desperately to fit in. I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to stand out. Yet, I didn't speak English very well. I looked different, and my name was certainly different. And I was also naive, too naive to understand the tensions around my religion. Even then, being a Muslim was not popular. There were several years in school that were very difficult. I was ostracized, and as we heard in the video, kids were mean. I was ostracized for my differences, and in one particular year, ostracized for my religion. All of these experiences impacted me. Growing up, I defined my identity as everything but Muslim. I was Canadian, Iranian, a woman, eventually an MBA, a working professional, but I silenced my Muslim identity, certainly in public. And you can say that I hid it behind, perhaps, an invisible veil. There were times when in public I would hear comments that made me feel very uncomfortable about Muslims. There were often stereotypes, but even then, I was silent. I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm sure many of you can relate where you may have kept silent about a part of you that was different from the norm. For me, it was my Muslim identity. For you and others, it may be your culture, the color of your skin, your gender, maybe your sexual orientation, or any other aspect of you that makes you feel different. But why? So the question I asked is why? Why is that? Why do we remain silent? And the reasons are often very complex and many. I know in my case, over the years, I remained silent because it was too risky. Sometimes it was too risky to speak out when you're a minority. Sometimes I wanted to manage my image in public. Sometimes I felt that if I spoke out, my opinions wouldn't be valued, that it would be futile. And there were times when I was scared. I was scared that if I said something unacceptable, that I would be rejected, that I would be labeled. And research tells us that if we're silent about just one issue that's personally important to us, chances are we'll be silent on other things that matter as well. Then came a defining moment in my life when I went from silence to eventually finding my voice. I started my doctorate a few years ago, and at that time, if you'd asked me, I would have never imagined this experience being one of those catalyst moments. And in looking back, I now understand what my parents meant by education being the key to freedom. In my case, it was freedom from my own self-limiting beliefs. About a year after I started my doctorate, I was on a road trip to Montreal, and my husband and I were whiling away the hours listening to the radio. We were listening to the news, and they were talking about a controversial piece of legislation that was being introduced in Quebec called Bill 94. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, in essence, the bill precludes women or people that have their faces covered from seeking essential government services like childcare, like healthcare, and also government jobs. So in a sense, the bill targeted Muslim women who wear the niqab, which is a cloth that covers the face. Now, at that point in my life, I had denied my Muslim identity, yet when I heard the debates and when I heard what was being talked about, something resonated with me. And I felt compelled to understand why this was happening in Quebec. And I felt compelled to understand how people from all sides were depicting Muslim women and the veil. And so I've devoted the last 3 years of my life, I've made it my priority to understand these depictions by looking at Canadian media. Before I get into the results, I'd like to talk a little bit about the veil. The veil comes in many different forms, and it has many different names, from the hijab to the niqab to the chador, burqa, and so on and so forth. But as I talk briefly about my research, I'll refer to it as the veil to signify all these different variations. When I started my study, I looked strictly at articles that talk about Bill 94, and I separated out voices of Muslims and non-Muslims that are against the veil. I also looked at voices of Muslim women who wear the veil so that I could see what was going on. For those that stood against, some common themes emerged from my data. Things like depictions of women like they're backwards, they're oppressed, they're to be pitied, and they're in need of saving from themselves and the oppressive males in their lives. The idea being that by wearing the veil, they were denied their freedom. I then looked at, as I said, the voices of Muslim women who do wear the veil. And what emerged in these interviews was that most talked about it being a choice for them. And they wear the veil, they define their identity and wear the veil for many different reasons. The veil is a sign of their faith, their devotion. It shows modesty. For some, the veil symbolizes dignity, respect, and privacy when they engage publicly. And to these women, the veil is seen as liberating and empowering. I also came across another theme, and that's Muslim women who choose to wear the veil, often despite family and parental pressures not to. To them, the veil symbolizes their Muslim identity, often to challenge the stereotypes and the discriminatory acts towards their community. So I got some answers, but now what? For me personally, in my personal life, I felt like this. I was very confused, and I was in a bit of a crisis. On the one hand, I thought about my own Muslim identity growing up. I thought about the women in my life, in my circles, that had the freedom to practice their religion and to choose. On the other hand, I couldn't deny to myself that I also had some perceptions of some women's lives and some cultural practices that fit some of those stereotypes. I felt all kinds of emotions, from anger, confusion, frustration, and the whole time I kept asking myself, which side of the debate do you sit in? Which side are you on? And it seemed awfully simplistic to even try to pick sides. Eventually, I found my voice in what I call the space in the hyphen. The space in the hyphen. This is the in-between space where differences can be entertained and can be assumed. In this space, for me, identity is not fixed. Identity is very complex. And in this space, identity may shift, mutate, and change over time. For me in this space, it's about women having the power to choose. It's about women having the freedom to practice their religion, whatever that is. And it's about having the choice to decide what we put on our bodies. But most importantly, to me, it's also the space where, as women, we must question the cultural and societal practices that don't work for us. The theme of this conference is lynchpin. And I'm here to say, from my own experience, don't let your own self-limiting beliefs or the opinions of others define you. As Seth Godin said in his book, being a lynchpin is about standing out. It's not about fitting in or being an invisible cog. It's about feeling the fear, but going ahead anyway. And it's about voicing those issues that are important to us, especially when they're tied to our identities, where they're very personal. But it's also more than that. It's about being a linchpin to others. I have a friend who has a saying. She often says that we need to create safe spaces for honest conversations. Safe spaces where all voices and all stories can be heard without anyone feeling threatened. We may not have the same views, but over time, we may come to understand. And over time, we may come to discover that what we share is our common humanity. It's the perspective of a Canadian, an Iranian, a Muslim, and a feminist who has embraced her hybrid identity. And by embracing all these different aspects of me, I have finally found my authentic voice. And that's a voice that I had lost a long time ago. That's all I have. Thank you.